Hello, this is Barbara. We're very happy to be a part of this webinar today. Welcome everyone. We're extremely excited as well about the possibility of seeing all of you in Orlando in August. And today we just hope to go over some background on the workshop, take some of your questions, and we look forward to the dialogue.
So just one question, is anyone hearing what we're saying? We've been having some transmission difficulties here on our end.
Yes, we are.
Okay, and can you see the PowerPoint slideshow that we
yes,
put?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. The question we're dealing with here is just simply the voice is coming through the phone, not through the computer. So we're not sure whether we have the best connection here. Well, anyway, welcome everyone. We're really pleased to have you here, and
we want to talk about the title, Homelessness and Helpfulness, what does leadership have to offer? And as you can see, we want to, at the PDW, have everyone working with practitioners who are very familiar with the homelessness issue, both in Central Florida and here in Minnesota, as well as having you work with, if you're a scholar, participate from your body of expertise to examine cross-sector leadership issues and how that might help people alleviate homelessness. And we're also using a design approach, and the question that is inspiring us is how might we identify the appropriate leadership skills and capabilities to support the integration of the needs of all stakeholders to end homelessness in Central Florida. And so, John, do you want to talk a bit about the issue of homelessness?
Well, as you all know, homelessness is actually quite a challenging problem, and it affects it affects simply thousands of people and many different kinds of people. Young, old, veterans, families, the disabled. Many of the homeless are full-time workers. They can't afford a home. Many are part-time. Many are employed. Many are ex-offenders. So that the different kinds of people who are affected by homelessness also make addressing homelessness effectively a real challenge. One thing that's also quite clear is that any really effective solution is going to require contributions from many different sectors, businesses, nonprofits, government, certainly, civil society organizations, and so on, and also require leadership of many kinds that crosses multiple boundaries, sectoral boundaries, level of government boundaries, time boundaries, boundaries of race, gender, class, and so on. And so homelessness is clearly one of, in some ways, a sort of classic wicked problem that, but one that can be addressed and should be addressed.
So here in Minnesota, we have had a great example of a partially successful cross-sector effort to address the issue of homelessness. What happened was that several people who were concerned about the homelessness issue came together about, I think, 5-6 years ago now to try to do something different about the homelessness issue. And they formed a campaign called Heading Home Hennepin, which really has been now inspired a statewide effort. It's also connected to really a nationwide movement that has developed the mentality that we can end homelessness. And I want to talk about some of the keys to success there, and we can talk about these more when we come together in Orlando. We'll have one of the key actors there, a county commissioner named Gail Dorfman, who can talk more about this. But we found, looking at this effort here in Minnesota, that there were many elements of cross-sector leadership that really seem to make a difference. And I'm just going to highlight a few of those, and people can ask about them if you want to. One of them is what we call taking advantage of and shaping a window of opportunity. And the people involved in this effort really had the ability to take advantage of some favorable political conditions, but also just the growing urgency of the homelessness problem. It had become very clear that traditional approaches relying on homeless shelters and arresting people who were on the streets simply wasn't working. And as more families became homeless, none of the system was really set up to support families very well. And so that urgency of the problem, in the sense that old solutions weren't working, as well as some favorable political conditions, really helped. Another element that we've identified in this case and many others is the willingness of people that we call sponsors and champions to get involved. And what we mean by sponsors are people with formal authority, such as elected officials, who can really deploy a lot of resources, including legitimacy, that they can endorse these activities. And in Minneapolis, the mayor, R.T. Ryback, Gail Dorfman, others on the county council, county commission really gave a lot of impetus. Also, in this case, a very respected downtown clergyman also lent his credentials to this whole endeavor and made a big difference. Sponsors we talk about as people with considerable energy and passion for an issue. They have a lot of informal authority, knowledge about the issue. In this case, a woman named Kathy Tinbrook was very important in helping to carry this out. Another thing I want to mention is the use of inclusive processes and structures. I'm not going to say too much about that, but really the need to involve multiple stakeholders. In this case, a commission was appointed by the elected officials, and they worked together for 100 days, listening to people who were homeless and formerly homeless, and becoming expert about homelessness, and developing a very specific agenda for eliminating homelessness in a 10-year span of time, a very ambitious outcome from their work. John, you wanted to say a little bit about how in these processes the whole issue of homelessness was reframed.
Yeah, so in this case, it seems like one of the things that helped was the reframing. So and the reframing included several parts. So one was the idea that shelter, which is what most of the expenditures had been on and where a lot of the effort was, shelters are not homes, and that having a home was actually important for providing a stable base for employment, help with any kinds of issues that a person needed to be addressed, and so on. So they actually, some just the labeling of the exercise as heading home Hennepin, and kind of they made use of the alliteration, seemed to help. So shelter's not home. And then the other reframing was that a home is cheaper than a shelter. If people can be housed in some kind of affordable housing or transitional housing of some kind, it's actually cheaper for the county and for government agencies than the revolving door of shelters. So there was a reframing around from moving from shelter to home, and then a reframing around the idea that a home is actually cheaper than a shelter. So that helped provide a kind of message that was that people were then able to use to influence decision makers. So the point here is that here's a case where where some things seem to be successful, but there really are many other circumstances around the country where homelessness is still an issue, as it is still an issue here in Minnesota. Efforts are being made in Central Florida, and we will have in the PDW practitioners and academics who've been paying careful attention to what's been going on in Central Florida. So we'll draw on these two particular examples in the PDW, the Hennepin County example in Central Florida, as useful for thinking about what all might be involved from both a scholarly and a practitioner perspective on addressing the issue of homelessness.
So the follow-on seminar, webinar that is coming up, we'll talk more about the approach, but we just want to emphasize that everyone who attends is going to be involved in very participative, facilitated discussions. We're going to be using the Design Thinking for Scholars framework. You'll get a handout that really outlines all the elements of that and uses the meeting design for challenge-based research. That's particularly helpful for cross-sector collaboration. John will go over the desired outcomes.
So we're hopeful that we'll collectively achieve a number of outcomes. So one is advancing the knowledge of and ability to apply the Design Thinking for Scholars framework on the part of all the participants. We hope to collectively deepen our understanding of the homelessness issue in relation to cross-sector collaboration and leadership research. Specifically in relation to Central Florida, we'd like to get specific about identifying some of the leadership and cross-sector collaboration concepts and practices that might be particularly helpful in Central Florida, but also might be generalized to other areas and other kinds of complex problems. And ideally, at the end, we'll create a research agenda based on tentative propositions that we developed during the workshop.
So that's really it on our presentation, and what we hope now is that we can field some questions from people in the audience.
I was just taking myself off mute. So what I'd like us to do, there's a hand-raising function that you can use to raise your hand, and I can open up your mic so that you can ask a question. I can also take questions that you can ask in the question function if you want to propose questions in the chat function there. I'll make me the presenter, and I'll open up the webinar so you can see. All right. You should be able to see both myself, hello everybody, and Barbara and John.
Hello.
So May has asked a question. May said, could you please explain more about the participant framework that you mentioned? May, if you're referring to Design Thinking for Scholars, that is part of the webinar that's coming up next, and we'll spend more time in depth during that period of time reviewing that. But if you are talking about the participation on the day or the participation of external stakeholders in the program, I think that's something that we could talk about now. So if you could reframe your question so we know which particular participant framework you were referring to, that would be helpful. And Naga has asked, what has been the major leadership challenges identified in the current literature? From your perspective, Barbara and John.
Well, simply when you've got a very complex issue like homelessness that's also got a long history, there are going to be so many stakeholders involved that you've got to think about you know, what is their stake in homelessness? And I think one of the reasons that we've got the need to reframe homelessness is that it's simply not the way people have often thought about it. You know, it's not just down and out guys on the street corner. It's all these groups that we mentioned. And so this work of reframing, which is a really important leadership skill, to help people see that homelessness is something that affects all kinds of folks, and especially in the environment with the global recession, it can be anybody. You know, middle-class people have become homeless, and so so that's one element. Another element is, as John said, you know, the need to think about home rather than shelter, and that leads you to also think about how do you prevent people from falling into homelessness, because from a public policy standpoint, it's much more costly to assist people once they've become homeless than it is to keep them in housing. And so that's been one of the successes in Hennepin County, is the ability to focus on prevention. Sometimes it only takes a few $100s to keep a family in their apartment rather than having them evicted.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. John, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I'd just like to add a couple of things. One is that in terms of leadership, there's one of the big difficulties is the way money and the rules governing the money flow when it comes to addressing issues of homelessness. So the homeless typically have many challenges, and so they may have social services challenges, or mental health challenges, or chemical dependency challenges, or they may be ex-offenders, and so on, or they may be underage. And there are different funding streams to address each of those problems, and different rules governing those funding streams. And the way we've chosen to carve up responsibility organizationally across sectors for these various, to address these various issues, means there's a lot of separation organizationally and in terms of funding streams to address problems that affect individual homeless people holistically. So the homeless are actually the only generalists in the system, and they have almost no power. And the people who do have the power to affect them often don't know each other, let alone work together. So there are really important challenges there. And then a lot of the problems are just, let me just say one last thing. And I mention this just because I'm involved in a group right now, that a nonprofit organization that is trying to develop affordable housing for ex-offenders in downtown Minneapolis. And let me tell you, ex-offenders are not on anybody's agenda of desirable next-door neighbors. So there are issues around that. But part of the challenge with these ex-offenders is that many of them, well, first of all, they're disproportionately persons of color, and many of them are ex-offenders for essentially trivial offenses, but they're victims of third strike and you're out kinds of policies and so on. And so once you have on your record that you are an offender, at least right now, you're sentenced for life. You may serve your term, but when you're done, you're still in effect in jail, because you can't get credit. You can't rent. Nobody wants to rent to you. It's very difficult to. You can't vote. There are all kinds of things, pathways to being able to help yourself that are simply closed off because you're an ex-offender, and I repeat, ex-offender. You're still in jail. The sentence is not over, and so so that addressing that issue involves getting legislative. The laws have to change.
So there's a leadership from a public policy perspective, but a leadership directly at the legislative level as well.
Exactly.
We've got a question from Raphael. Raphael, I'm going to unmute you so you'll be able to ask your question. You should be able to speak and be heard now. Raphael?
I'm sorry. Now I realize that you are unmuting me and that I can do it right here. Are you hearing
Yes.
me, by the way?
We can hear you.
Are you hearing me?
Yes.
We are hearing you, sir.
Okay. With some lag, some delay. I'm going to basically read what I just wrote here. Is that okay?
Sure.
Sure.
Okay, here I go. So, first of all, I am very happy about this conversation. Lovely. Second, unfortunately, I won't be at AOM this time in Orlando, but now that I received this email, now I know that there are some communities within AOM who I am going to continue to be in touch with. And finally, my question, comment. Okay, so I've been persuaded with economist Sen's, SEN, perspective and development, which are bottom up. I believe the year 2000 is the year of that publication. Should there be, and this is my question, should there be a feedback loop, or is there already being proposed between the homeless community directly and the experts who are empowering themselves to find out firsthand about their issues? In other words, how to make sure the community is made part, is integrated in the efforts being mobilized on their behalf. I hope that this is clear. I don't want to go any further unless you need a clarification from me.
I think it was clear, and what I understood was you're asking about how, to what extent people who are experiencing homelessness or have experienced homelessness have been involved in these efforts to eliminate homelessness. And one thing that's happened in preparation for the PDW is that one of our colleagues, Ron Piccolo, has had students talking to multiple stakeholders, including people who are or have experienced homelessness, trying to get their perspective on, what are the causes, what are some of the solutions. Certainly in Minnesota, people who have experienced homelessness have been involved a lot in terms of helping all the other stakeholders really get a perspective from them. And has everything worked out perfectly in Minnesota? No, it has not. But I think to the extent it has, some of that has been due to really involving people who've got this experience in shaping the agenda for action.
Great, thank you, Barbara. Raphael, if you were asking a follow-up, I had to put you on mute because we were getting some feedback on the line. So, if you were asking a follow-up, I had to put you on mute because we were getting some feedback.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. We've got a couple of questions that are typed questions. Naga has actually got 3 questions, so I'm just going to break them down and give them to you one at a time. The first is, in your research, Barbara and John, where is the desired leadership usually located or found to address this particular topic?
Well, it's the leadership is clearly shared. So because multiple kinds of organizations from different sectors need to be involved to address the issue effectively, you have to have leaders from multiple sectors and so on. There also have to be some very committed advocates who are willing to help get the conversation going. And to help get the issue on the agenda, so that the homeless are not a power block. They are not a coalition. They're not an organized interest group. They have trouble just sort of getting through their own individual lives, or their family through their own lives, just day by day. So they're not a group who can get the issue on the agenda.
Right.
So others have to be their advocates. And it takes, our experiences with the example here in Minnesota, and it just took some people who were just deeply committed, including congregations who were who really wanted to be, who saw this as a part of their calling. So it wasn't just government, it was a civil society, if you will. And as Barbara mentioned, a particular minister of a prominent downtown congregation played a very important role. So shared leadership of multiple kinds from many organizations.
They're built on pre-existing relationships often.
Okay. I think one of the things that Naga was looking for, and I think you've touched on it, John, was that he was wondering if it was coming from a particular sector in the community, and I think you cited the Hennepin County example from your own experience. So I think we've covered Naga's questions. Another question would be, and this is from May, and May is asking. What, in your opinion, should be the role of government and policy? We've touched on government and policy as part of the response, but what do you see it having a singular or a particular role, or are there multiple roles that plays?
Well, I guess we'd have to say multiple roles. I think government can't solve this issue on its own, particularly in a climate where there are so many demands on government resources. And, you know, we are concerned about raising taxes and so forth. So certainly there's room to redirect the government resources that have been channeled to this kind of issue. One of the things that happened in Minnesota, I mentioned, you know, the importance of inclusive structures. So what government was able to do was set up a joint office between the city and the county, which is very unusual here, to take on this 10-year campaign. But that office had very small staff. Crucially, though, one of the chief champions of the homelessness campaign here in Minnesota became the coordinator of that office. And so then that office, which was government funded, set up in government offices, was able to activate or catalyze this entire network of other groups that could help move specific kinds of initiatives through. And some of them have been extremely successful. And so, for example, we didn't mention really business leadership in all of this. Well, downtown businesses in Minneapolis, were very concerned about people on the streets, panhandling, and so forth. And there were some people who were, let's say, chronically homeless, who were on the streets in Minneapolis. And so the businesses were operating out of self-interest to try to do something about this. Some of them certainly were, I guess, had some altruistic motives, but you've got to think about people's self-interest in all of this. And so they worked with some of the downtown congregations and a shelter that was kind of on the fringes of downtown to set up case managers for helping specific individuals find shelter and eventually homes. And that has been a very successful initiative. Some government participation, foundation funds, a lot of in-kind work by all these volunteers. There's something called Minnesota Project Connect, Homeless Connect, that's a huge gathering, I think twice a year now at our big convention center. And that brings services for homeless people together all in one place. Some of our biggest corporations like Target send many employees to volunteer on that day. And so government has a role. It has some things that others can't do about, as John was saying earlier, changing laws that are big barriers, providing seed money, or in this case, you know, an office, an official office. But you know, this is complex, it's complicated. We need to draw on the strengths of all sectors because all sectors are part of causing the problem in the first place.
I guess the only thing I'd add to that, I think government does have an important role, including as a cause of homelessness. So a number, again, my most recent involvement is around this issue of trying to provide affordable housing for ex-offenders. And there are, so I mentioned one law, like not being able to expunge a record just causes enormous trouble. So that's a law. Another thing that's caused homelessness, has aggravated the homelessness issue in here and around the country is lax government regulation of the financial services industry and the housing industry, the mortgage industry that led to just massive foreclosures. That was a government failure, and so anyway, that government clearly has an important role and is a major actor. But to repeat what Barbara said, government simply cannot do it alone, and government actually can't do things by itself without support of elected officials and the citizenry. So we live in a democracy, and there are things that governments can and can't do depending on what the citizens want them to do.
Great, thank you. Thanks, John. I think we've got a follow up from May in terms of the role of government. I think you've answered her question in terms of is the role of government singular, and I think identifying government as one player among many. You talked a little bit about the role of government from a coordination perspective, but that's not the only role that it plays. But I think it's interesting that you also highlight the fact that government as a causal factor in terms of homelessness is something that needs to be certainly taken into account from a solution design perspective as well. I think in addressing homelessness, I think May's additional question is, I think, a very pertinent one. In the absence of government leadership in the area or not playing a coordinating role, is it possible for the other two stakeholder sectors to move in and fill that gap successfully?
An example, no, it is not possible. So homelessness, addressing the issue of homelessness, there are multi-pronged solutions, right? So the best thing for helping people not be homeless is for them to have living wage jobs, and so they have the wherewithal to provide housing for themselves. The businesses have to, for the most part, we rely on businesses to produce housing. The builders, the contractors, the housing industry, the apartment owners, and so on. We rely on them to actually build the housing, so there's a supply available. But at least for many of the homeless people are. So there's a group of homeless people who actually are working full time and they simply can't afford housing. It's just the supply is not there, and they cannot provide effective demand at a high enough level to induce the private sector to build housing that would house them. So they're a group of people who need help. There's some people who can't afford housing under any circumstances, and you need to have it supplied for and typically some kind of government funding, whether through housing vouchers or some other kind of supplemental government support, can help them afford the housing. There are other people who don't make enough money and need some kind of supplement to make the housing affordable for them. And typically the scale of what we're talking about here simply requires government to be involved as a funder in some way. There are just simply way too many homeless people to expect other sectors to do it by themselves. I mean, we're talking thousands and thousands of people and across the country, and many of whom have very difficult challenges that housing alone won't address.
And it's not to say that a foundation working with businesses couldn't somehow create new housing for a group of people, but that's an isolated accomplishment. And so our point is that if you're really going to eliminate homelessness over the long haul, those little, they're great, these projects that might not involve government, they're great, but they're not going to take care of the major dimensions of the problem.
Great. We've certainly got time for a few more questions. If there are any other questions, I think. Oh, interesting. May has just asked if is homelessness a market, or should it be a market? If you have, I guess in the context of market-based solutions, that's interesting. So yes, what are your thoughts on that?
Homelessness is a market, and it's just not a big enough market. So what HUD Section 8 vouchers do is basically put some effective demand behind homeless people. There are the Earned Income Tax Credit puts some effective demand behind homeless people. So there are ways of using the tax code or direct government expenditures that help create a market. It's just not a big enough market to actually address the whole problem. And so market-based solutions are important. Let me give an example. So I mentioned this project that the nonprofit group I'm working with is working on for ex-offenders. So this has gone on for now a couple of years, trying to pull together the financing to make this project work. So there's some, and mainly it's government financing of one kind or another to make it work. But the simply providing housing for the ex-offenders is not enough. You actually have to provide supportive services as well. So you have to pull together that money too. So governments have been there, but it's actually been a nonprofit. There's several nonprofits working on the homelessness issue in Minnesota and in the county that we live in here. One of them is called Beacon. It just changed its name through, and I can't remember it. So like Beacon Interfaith Housing. It's a coalition of 50 congregations, and essentially what they're doing is providing the funding for a group of staff to pull together funding from various places to build what are in effect demonstration projects. So this housing for ex-offenders will be viewed as a demonstration project because the idea here is not to just build housing for 40 people who are important in their own right. The idea is to affect public policy so that more ex-offenders can be treated treated to affordable housing. The previous project that this group of ours worked on created what has become kind of a model facility for homeless teenagers that was used effectively. So it opened a couple of years ago. It was used effectively by advocates for the homeless in the state legislature in the most recent legislative session to pass a Homelessness Teenagers Act that dramatically increased funding to address the issue of homelessness. So it was a case of governmental entities, but also nonprofit entities and businesses working together to essentially build the case and the coalition to affect public policy that could affect many larger numbers of homeless people. So it's a complicated business, and the leadership issues and challenges of this kind of cross-sector collaboration are really extraordinary. And that's why we think this PDW can be so helpful and important. If we as scholars can help address an issue this tough, we will have really accomplished something.
And I do want to emphasize the important contribution that researchers can make. Here in Minnesota, people from the university, including master's students here at Humphrey, have helped evaluate the impact of particular initiatives within the Heading Home Hennepin project. We have something called Wilder Research that conducts a survey annually of homeless people throughout the state. So both the kind of theorizing and data gathering that researchers can do, both at universities and in other organizations, can really contribute to having, let's say, evidence-based decision-making in these areas. And so I want to emphasize that as well.
Sorry, just pulling myself off mute. Thanks, Barbara, for that, and thank you for your response, John. I think what we've been talking about so far is actually bringing up. Obviously, it's an issue which resonates with people. Otherwise, we wouldn't have taken time out of our days to participate. And I think May raised an interesting question. Well, she said from her perspective, housing is only one part of the solution. And I think in the way we label these kinds of societal issues, I think language has a fundamental bearing on the way we design solutions for that. And her open question is: are there models that map such wicked problems? I mean, to your point, John, this is a huge problem, and the access points, Barbara, from perspective in terms of opportunities for research, in terms of unpacking the scale of this problem, are manifold. I guess. I mean, it's fundamental to the work that we'll be doing during the PDW. But is there a way to unpack this problem so that we can take some meaningful action around it, from your perspective?
Well, absolutely. And I think one thing that might be helpful is a teaching case that we put together about the Heading Home Hennepin initiative, and you can find that case by Googling the Hubert Project. Hubert, H-U-B-E-R-T, the Hubert Project. And so you can, once you get to that website, you can find this teaching case on the Heading Home Hennepin Project.
So Barbara, could you just tell me what that website is again? I'm going to send that out to everybody.
If you Google Hubert Project, and I think it's something like hubertproject.org, then you can find a teaching case that we've written on the Heading Home Hennepin Project. And that'll give you some very clear ideas about how, rather small group of initiators actually got something going. And I think, as I said earlier, you do need to assess the context that you're working in. Are there certain aspects of the political system where you can find or help? In this case, actually, Gail Dorfman, I think, would be the first to say that homelessness was not high on her agenda when she became a county commissioner. However, this very determined champion, Kathy Tinbrook, who had worked with homeless people for years and years, showed up in her office very early on, and I think had been out demonstrating with some homeless folks, and she said, "This is incredibly important. We need your help." And the fact that she got there at the beginning of this new commissioner's term and kind of raised her awareness of it, got her involved, opened her eyes. These things start in very, I suppose, small-scale ways. And so, and yet, in Kathy's case, she was very well informed. She knew what she was talking about. And so she was working from a base. And so that helped, I talk about shaping windows of opportunity. It helped make the political conditions favorable. But behind that were previous cooperative efforts by the city and the county. That was important. Sometimes you have to wait till the time is right. Sadly, in this case, we had to wait till old solutions had failed. Gather your evidence. Figure out, do your stakeholder analysis. We think that is the key to the universe for leaders trying to deal with complex problems.
Well, it's part of the universe. I think actually the issue of homelessness is just quite an amazing research opportunity because it's such a complex problem, and the issue is inherently interdisciplinary and rich. And for scholars who are wondering about how might this kind of research affect one's career, I just point to two very prominent and well-known leaders in the Academy of Management, Jane Dutton and Janet Dukeridge, who wrote an article 20 years ago in the Academy of Management Journal about how the New York Port Authority dealt with the issue of homelessness. That article is one of the most highly cited articles ever published in the Academy of Management Journal, and it's just kind of a rich source of insight. I required of students, and still require that some students in the course I teach. So this is a great opportunity, I think, for people as well.
Good. Thank you, John. Thank you, Barbara. I think we've got time for just one more question from the field. Naga keeps sending me the links to the subject matter, but he's sending me a corrected link now, so I'm just sending that out. That's going out. Carrie Olberger has a question that I think is kind of a good bridging question. She's curious to hear from both of you, Barbara and John, in terms of your perspective on how leadership in the field of homelessness is different or similar to leadership efforts necessary for other social services like education or healthcare.
I think we would say it's more similar than different. One of the ongoing research directions that we pursue is to understand what seems to be kind of typical leadership practices that seem to help overcome the barriers to cross-sector collaboration. And we don't find that the policy area makes that much difference. That understanding the context, diagnosing what's going on, looking at the past, thinking about, what is there that if you're going to be successful, that you need to preserve about that context. So in the case of Heading Home Hennepin, one of the things that was worth preserving was a tradition of kind of activist faith groups that were going to be powerful resources for making progress. So what about your context is worth, enhancing or reinforcing that can help you going forward? You don't have to change everything. In fact, you can't. And so if we're dealing with something like the achievement gap, and it's no different. You're going to have to pay attention to the specific context you're working in. You're going to have to find probably more than one good champion, more than one really committed sponsors who maybe won't be involved in the day-to-day, but who are very willing to, show up at the press conference and put their stamp of legitimacy on this kind of thing. John and I have looked at cases from transportation to education to regional information systems. I've studied the Business Council, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and we see the same kinds of things every time you see, evidence of success in cross-sector collaboration. I think there's more that can be similar about these things than different.
I would emphasize, though, that we jointly certainly have no general theory of leadership to offer here. We're much more we're sort of in the area of practice theory and qualitative research, and trying to understand how you can generalize from what you can generalize from secondhand experience to other situations, and then what specific kind of contingencies or caveats would you need to be particularly attentive to when you move from one kind of situation to the next. So there are certain kind of common truths that might be generalizable across situations, but there are also truths of difference across situations as well that really need to be taken into account. So we're I guess we would probably place ourselves at the nexus of theory and practice.
I guess another thing I would add is simply that people need to be always alert to how, say, a general practice applies in a particular situation at a particular time. And there are all kinds of ways that cross-sector collaborations can go wrong. And a lot of us researchers have delighted in pointing out those things.
Yeah, that's a market, actually. Pointing out ways that things can go wrong.
And I think one of the things that people also need to realize is that, we talk about inclusive structures and practices, but those can take many forms. Collaboration doesn't mean that everybody shows up with an equal amount of power and equal amount of expertise. So you've got to figure out ways to include people in the appropriate, most effective ways. And while we're talking about collaboration, it doesn't mean that hierarchy goes away. You've still got to deal with hierarchical structures. You don't dispel them. And so I think that's the kind of thing that it would be fun to talk a lot more about at the webinar. At the actual PDW.
Great. Well, Barbara and John, I want to thank you very much for your time today and for sharing a preview of what's to come during the PDW and for sharing from your experience, your rich experience regarding homelessness. And I look forward to seeing you in Orlando. Thank you very much, everybody, for your patience being online. And the recording, fingers crossed that we've got good audio. The recording will be up and available shortly. I'll be working with the NLS PDW design team to make sure that that's available to everybody. But thank you once again for your time, and that's it for our first webinar on homelessness and helpfulness. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.